At 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, on the fourth floor of an abandoned textile mill on the Providence waterfront, a young woman lay flat on a bed of broken concrete, with her cheek pressed against the stock of a rifle. She was 27 years old. She wore an orange food delivery jacket with the company logo stitched over the left pocket, one sleeve torn away at the shoulder. Her jeans were faded, her sneakers had a hole in the toe, and her fingerless gloves were the only thing between her hands and the October cold coming through the shattered window. There was cement dust across her face, and a streak of dried blood on her cheek that wasn't hers. Behind her, slumped against the wall, sat a man in a charcoal three-piece suit that had cost more than her car. Ezra Marchetti was 34 years old, and he owned nearly half the harbor she was staring out at. His jacket was ripped open at the shoulder. His silk tie was gone. His white shirt was soaked through, and the gold watch on his wrist was, at that particular moment, the most useless object in the building. A few hours earlier, one of his men had tried to hand her $200 as a tip, and she'd pushed it back and told him the delivery fee came to $38, so $38 was what she'd take. A few hours earlier, he hadn't realized she was standing right in front of him. Out there in the dark, past the rain and the broken cranes and the gray blocks of the shipyard, men were waiting for her to lift her head, and the one giving them orders had spent the whole night proving he wasn't in any hurry at all. He hadn't shot to kill. Not once. He'd put a man on the ground and left him lying there under the emergency light, and then he'd told his shooters to hold, because he wanted the ones still breathing to sit in the dark and do the arithmetic and find out which of them would break first. He called it patience. He'd counted 11 men inside that mill, and he'd counted right. What he hadn't counted was the 12th. Ezra's voice came out low and cracked, and he asked her where she'd learned to do this. She didn't take her eye off the scope. She said her father taught her, before he died. Then she breathed out and squeezed the trigger. If you're hooked already, hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. Share this with someone who loves a story about an ordinary person on an impossible night, and subscribe so you don't miss how this one ends. Now let's go back 14 hours, to the morning before any of this began. That morning began with the sound of a clothes dryer vibrating beneath the floor, a sound Maeve Callahan had grown so accustomed to that she no longer heard it. The room she rented was directly above the laundromat on the corner of Broad Street, with a low ceiling and a window facing a brick wall. Cold in winter and so hot in summer that she had to sleep with the door open. She paid the rent on time every month, and every month she had to calculate what she would cut back on so she could keep paying it on time. On the refrigerator door, beneath a seashell-shaped magnet her younger sister had bought on some long-ago trip to the beach, was the hospital bill. $61,400. She didn't put it away. She kept it there, directly in her line of sight. So every time she opened the refrigerator to take out the milk, she saw it again, because she was afraid that if she put it away, one day she might grow accustomed to not seeing it, and getting used to that would mean she had given up. Her phone vibrated while she was tying back her hair. Bridget was calling from school, speaking as quickly as she always did. Quickly because she was trying to get everything out before she lost her nerve. Tuition was going up next semester. Not by much, the girl said. Only a little more than last semester. And I'm looking for an evening job in the cafeteria. I think I can manage it. So don't worry. Maeve listened until she was finished. She looked out at the brick wall beyond the window and let her younger sister finish the speech she'd clearly rehearsed, then said, "I'll take care of it." She said it in the voice of someone who had said those words too many times for them to remain a promise. They had become a habit, the way she closed a conversation she didn't want to continue. Bridget was silent for a while on the other end. Then she asked how their mother had been yesterday, and Maeve said their mother had slept a lot, and the nurse said that was a good thing. They both knew it wasn't a good thing. They both left it there. After the call ended, Maeve stood in the middle of the room for a while longer, still holding the phone, then turned and opened the closet. In the corner, behind several winter coats and a cardboard box that hadn't been opened since the day she moved in, there was a guitar case. It was old, the fabric covering worn through at the corners, and a faded leather cord was still tied around the handle. She pulled it out, brushed the thin layer of dust away with the back of her hand, and set it on the bed. There was no guitar inside that case. There never had been. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. She sat there for a very long time, long enough for the dryer downstairs to finish one load and begin another. She didn't open the case. She only rested one hand on the worn fabric, the way someone places a hand on the shoulder of a sleeping person they don't want to wake. There are things in life people don't dare open, not because there is anything frightening inside, but because once they open them, they will have to remember, and remembering means having to make some kind of decision. She hadn't opened it in 7 years. For 7 years, it had sat in the corner of her closet, like a silent tenant, following her through 3 moves, through rooms that grew smaller each time. Finally, she took out her phone and called Mr. Farrow's pawn shop on Broad Street, exactly 4 blocks from where she lived. The person on the other end asked what the item was. She told him. There was a brief silence. Then he asked whether she had all the paperwork, and she said yes. Everything was complete. The ownership had been legally transferred years ago. They agreed on 8 o'clock that evening, after her shift ended. She thanked him, ended the call, and sat a little longer with the case on the bed. Then she stood, carried it downstairs, passed through the laundromat where the owner was folding towels, nodded in greeting, and walked out to the old car parked along the curb. She placed the case in the trunk, where it fit neatly between the toolbox and several insulated food delivery bags. Then she took the folded raincoat she kept there and spread it over the case carefully, pulling both edges across until it was completely covered, as though she were afraid rain might somehow find its way inside the trunk. She closed the trunk. She stood there for 1 more second with her hand resting on the cold metal, then got into the car, opened the app, and accepted her first delivery of the day. As she drove away from Broad Street, she lowered the window slightly to keep herself awake, and for reasons she couldn't explain, an old voice rose clearly inside her mind, so clearly, it was as though the person were sitting in the passenger seat beside her. The bullet you can't take back is the bullet you carry for the rest of your life. At noon, that same day, only a few blocks from where Maeve was making her second delivery, Ezra Marchetti sat at the innermost corner table of a small restaurant called Salvarosa on Federal Street, his back to the wall and his face toward the door. He hadn't chosen that seat. No one in his family had ever needed to choose it. His grandfather had sat at that exact table, then his father after him, and the servers at Salvarosa, going all the way back to the previous owner, knew never to seat anyone there before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was one of countless habits he had inherited, along with the family name, habits he still hadn't managed to shed because they had worked their way into him before he was old enough to understand what they meant. The man sitting across from him was named Rutledge, a construction contractor in his 50s, and the hands he had placed on the table couldn't remain still. He talked for nearly 10 minutes. He talked about the project in Olneyville that had stalled because of permits, about 2 suppliers who had walked away, about his daughter having just started college, and he said all of it in the voice of a man who knew perfectly well that there was always a reason, and that reasons were never enough. What he wanted was more time on the money Ezra's father had loaned him several years earlier, a debt handwritten on a single sheet of paper. No notarization, no bank, nothing required except a signature, and the unspoken understanding of what would happen if it wasn't repaid. Ezra didn't interrupt him once. He let the man finish everything, including the parts he repeated, including the moment when his voice began to shake and he had to stop to drink some water. That too was a habit Ezra had inherited. His father had taught him that people would eventually tell you what you needed to know if you were willing to stay silent long enough, and afterward they would remember that silence for the rest of their lives. When Rutledge finished, Ezra reached inside his coat and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, opened it, and placed it on the table so the man could see his own handwriting at the bottom. Then Ezra picked it up, tore it in half, stacked the 2 pieces together, and tore them once more. Rutledge didn't have time to react. He only stared at the scraps lying on the tablecloth, his face turning white, as though he'd just witnessed something even more frightening than having the debt collected. Ezra said the debt no longer existed. He said it had never existed, and if Rutledge ever heard anyone mention it again, or if he himself mentioned it to anyone, even his wife, even to say thank you, then Ezra would understand that he wanted the debt to exist again. He said it in the flat, ordinary voice of someone reading from a menu. Rutledge nodded several times in a row, stood up, bumped into his chair, apologized to the chair, then walked straight out the door without looking back once. Warren Ashby had been sitting at the table the entire time, one hand resting on a stack of files, and he waited until the sound of the bell above the door had completely faded before speaking. He didn't speak loudly. He was the kind of man who never did. He said that was the 4th debt this month, and he asked whether Ezra knew what he was doing. Ezra said he did. Ashby removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, put them back on, then said he wasn't opposed to Ezra wanting things clean. He only wanted him to understand that the people around him might not want the same thing, and that when a man in Ezra's position started throwing away the things that made others afraid of him, someone would eventually sit down and calculate how much fear was left. He said, "You're cutting off your own hand, Ezra." Ezra looked at him for a moment, then said, "I'm cutting off the hand that's been choking 3 generations of my family. And if losing one hand is what it costs to stop choking anyone else, that's a cheap price." Ashby didn't answer. He only exhaled very softly, the way a man does when he has spent too many nights awake over other people's troubles. He had been beside this family since before Ezra could walk, had read the eulogy at his father's funeral, had been the only person who ever told him that he didn't have to become his father. Ezra was grateful to him in the way people are grateful to someone who has simply always been there, and he never said it aloud. Then he moved on to the matter of that evening. He said tonight they would hand over the Foundation survey records to the engineering team at the Corliss textile mill by the harbor. Everyone present, contracts, invoices, every piece of documentation that 3 generations of his family had never bothered to keep. Ashby asked why they didn't simply do it at the office where it would be easier. Ezra said because he wanted everything to happen somewhere everyone could see it. His phone vibrated. Rosetta was calling, asking whether he would be home for dinner because she'd already cooked. He said, "Tomorrow, Grandma. I have something tonight." On the other end, his grandmother was silent for exactly 1 beat before saying, "All right, tomorrow is fine too. Just remember to eat something." By evening, the rain had started. The kind of October rain that wasn't heavy but refused to stop. Enough to make the harbor roads shine beneath the lights and slow every delivery by about 5 minutes. Maeve had been taking orders non-stop since the afternoon without stopping to eat, and when she turned onto Broad Street, Mr. Farrow's shop door had already been pulled shut, the sign turned to the side that said closed, and only one small light remained on inside for security. She pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, and sat looking at that door for about half a minute. 15 minutes late. Only 15 minutes. She called the number from that morning, let it ring all the way through until voicemail picked up, then ended the call before the automated greeting could begin. She thought about coming back tomorrow, then thought about tomorrow's work schedule, and let the idea go. The case was still in the trunk beneath the raincoat, exactly where she'd placed it that morning. She was about to open the app and end her shift when a new order appeared. A large order, 12 meals, going to an address in the Harbor Industrial District. No restaurant name, no building name, an address code by the docks that she recognized immediately, with a single note saying to knock on the side door. The pay for that one delivery was nearly as much as everything she'd made all evening combined. She accepted it. The road toward the harbor was empty, the streetlights far apart, and when the app told her she'd arrived, she had to use the light from her phone to find the side entrance of the old textile mill. She carried 2 large insulated bags and had to make 2 trips to bring everything in. The man who opened the door was middle-aged, his salt and pepper hair cut short. He opened it only a crack at first, then all the way, looked once over her shoulder before looking at her face. He took the bags, opened them, checked every container, counted them, then nodded. Inside was a wide room filled with dust and old machinery, several folding tables set up temporarily, construction lights strung along the walls, and about 10 people bent over large sheets of plans spread across the tables. Gideon took out his wallet, tucked 2 $100 bills into the receipt, and handed the whole thing to her. Maeve looked down, pulled the 2 bills free, and placed them back into his palm. She said she only took what the delivery fee came to, and she said it in the ordinary voice of someone repeating a number from a receipt. No performance, no pride, simply because that was how it was. The man hesitated. At the far end of the room, someone leaning over the plans lifted his head. He was much younger than the older man, wearing a suit with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he looked at her longer than was necessary for a food delivery woman standing in a doorway. Then he spoke to Gideon in Italian, his voice low but not lowered very much, saying that she had just refused an amount equal to several days of her wages, and telling him to remember her face. Maeve had already turned to leave when she stopped. She looked back, met his eyes directly, and answered in the same language. Only 3 words. "I can hear you." Her grandmother had been born in Abruzzo and come here at 19. And throughout Maeve's childhood, she had sat in the kitchen listening to the old woman speak that language to someone over the telephone. Ezra Marchetti froze. He didn't blush, didn't apologize, didn't laugh it away. He simply stood there with both hands still resting on the edge of the plans, looking at her in a completely different way from how he'd looked at her only seconds earlier. The way someone looks after realizing he has misjudged something and hasn't yet figured out how badly. The older man looked from him to her, then back to him, and said nothing. Maeve folded the receipt, slipped it into her coat pocket, said thank you, wished everyone a good meal, then turned toward the door. She took 4 steps. On the 4th, every light in the mill went out at once, the entire row, all together, and darkness dropped so quickly that her eyes still held the after-image of the construction lights for another beat. Then behind her, the steel roll-up door at the entrance gave a long metallic shriek and slammed down against the concrete floor. The sound of the steel door slamming down hadn't even faded when the glass began to break. Not in one place, but 3, from 3 different directions, separated by only a few breaths, and it was the way the glass broke that made the men inside the mill understand immediately that this wasn't a robbery. The windows weren't breaking because someone was throwing rocks. They were shattering from high above, cleanly, 1 pane at a time, and after each one, there came a brief silence. The silence of someone taking aim again. Someone shouted for everyone to get down. Everyone did. Maeve pressed herself flat against the cold concrete floor, exactly 4 steps from the door, one hand still gripping the strap of the empty insulated bag, and there was no clear thought in her mind yet, only the pounding of her heart and the simple awareness that she shouldn't be here. Gideon crawled to the electrical panel, opened it, then called back that the generator had been cut from outside. It hadn't failed. Someone had cut it. One person pulled out a phone, then a second, then a third. No one had a signal, not a weak signal, not one flickering bar, but nothing at all. The flat emptiness people normally only saw deep inside a tunnel. The man named Wes Halloran was the youngest member of the surveying team, and he was the only one still standing because he was at the far end of the mill where the document cases had been left, and he thought that if he ran fast enough, he could make it. He ran. He crossed the open floor between 2 rows of old weaving machines, and he made it more than halfway before he went down. There was no loud blast, only one sharp crack from very far away, then the sound of him falling, then the sound of him trying to drag himself forward another arm's length before stopping. He lay there in the open, beneath the emergency light mounted on a concrete column, the only light still burning in the entire building because it ran on its own battery. He lay inside that dull yellow pool of light, like something someone had deliberately placed on a stage. Then everything outside went silent. No second shot, no footsteps, no voices, nothing except rain tapping against the metal roof and the breathing of more than a dozen people pressed close to the floor in the darkness. Someone started to crawl toward him. Ezra said no. He said only that one word, very softly, but everyone in the mill heard it. The man stopped, because all of them, even the least experienced among them, had just understood the same thing. Whoever was outside hadn't stopped shooting because he was out of ammunition, or because he'd left. He had stopped because he wanted Wes to remain where he was. He wanted those sounds of pain to carry through the entire building. He was waiting to see who wouldn't be able to bear it. Gideon drew his gun and crawled toward the broken window, looked out into the rain, then crawled back. He didn't fire. 3 other men drew their guns too, and none of them knew where to point them. Ezra lay flat beside the leg of a folding table, his face turned toward the handguns sitting uselessly in the hands of his men, and told them to put them away. Someone asked why. He said because every gun we have put together can't reach even half the distance to where they're positioned, and if anyone fires a single shot, the only thing we'll accomplish is telling them exactly where we're hiding. He said we're throwing stones at an airplane. No one answered that. The emergency light on the concrete column kept burning. Wes was still lying inside that pool of yellow light, and he had stopped trying to drag himself away. Maeve looked at the open space between them. She was closer to him than anyone else in the building. She didn't spend long thinking about it, didn't weigh the risks, didn't wait for permission, because what happened inside her wasn't a decision at all. It was a reflex that had existed before she even knew she had it. She let go of the insulated bag, pressed her stomach to the floor, and crawled. She moved along the edge of the row of weaving machines, out of the darkness and toward the edge of that dull yellow light, and behind her, someone started to call out before cutting himself off. She grabbed the back of Wes's waistband and the collar of his shirt, drove all her strength through her legs, and pulled. He weighed much more than she did. She dragged him a short distance, lost her grip, grabbed him again, and the entire time she kept waiting to hear that sharp crack from outside once more. but it never came. She managed to pull him behind the concrete column just as both of her hands began to shake. Behind the concrete column, the light had been reduced to a narrow band spilling across the floor, enough to see your own hands, but not enough to make out color. Maeve dropped to her knees beside Wes, and the first thing she did was look for where the blood was coming from, not ask whether he was all right. She grabbed the sleeve of her own delivery jacket and tore hard along the shoulder seam until it came completely free, then folded it into a thick square and pressed it down. Wes gasped. She said she was sorry, but she didn't lift her hand. She held it there, counting silently, then leaned closer to look, and once she had seen enough, she knew the cloth wouldn't be enough. She looked around. Ezra was beside her now, kneeling on the opposite side. She looked at his neck and said, "Give me that." He didn't ask what she meant. He pulled off his tie, loosened the knot with 2 fingers, and handed it to her. She looped it around Wes's thigh above the darkened fabric, tied it once, then slid a ballpoint pen into the knot and began twisting. Wes clenched his teeth. She twisted another half-turn, then another, until the bleeding beneath her hand slowed and finally stopped completely, and she secured the pen in place with another strip of fabric. Then she pulled a second ballpoint pen from her pocket, the one she normally used to write house numbers and customer names on receipts, and wrote the hour and minute when she had applied the tourniquet directly across Wes's forehead. He felt the pen moving over his skin and asked what she was doing. She said, "So they know how long this has been on your leg." Then she added, without looking at anyone in particular, that from this moment on, a clock was running, and if it went beyond 2 hours, then even if they made it out of here, there was no guarantee the leg could still be saved. No one said anything. Gideon, lying several steps away, turned his head and stared at the number for a long time. From beginning to end, Maeve's hands didn't shake once. They moved through a sequence that seemed already written into them, one step and then the next, never hesitating anywhere, and that was what caught Ezra's attention, more than the fact that she had crawled into the open and dragged one of his men back. He looked at her hands, then at her face, and asked who she was. Maeve was finishing the final knot. She said, "I'm a food delivery driver." He kept looking at her. She repeated it, more slowly this time, saying, "I'm a food delivery driver," then bent down to check the pulse at Wes's wrist and said nothing else. Wes opened his eyes. He stared up at the dark ceiling for a while, then turned toward her and asked whether she was scared. She said yes. He gave a faint laugh, no more than a short breath, and said she didn't look like someone who was afraid. She said fear was a good thing. She said it kept people honest, reminded them that what was happening was real, and anyone who wasn't afraid inside a room like this wasn't looking at the right thing. Wes fell quiet and thought about that, then said his wife said things like that too. He said her name was Delia, that she was at home, and that they'd been married less than a year. He said she was a terrible cook, so terrible that he still had to pretend to praise her. And right now, for some reason he couldn't explain, he was thinking about the stew she'd made on Sunday, the one he'd eaten 2 bowls of before telling her it was good. Maeve listened to all of it. She didn't comfort him. She didn't tell him he was going to be fine, because she didn't say things she couldn't know were true. She only said, "Keep talking. Just keep talking. Say anything you want, and keep your eyes open." He asked why. She said, "Because as long as you can still talk, I know you're still here." Outside, the rain continued tapping steadily against the metal roof, and the emergency light still burned over the empty place where he had been lying. Once Wes could speak in full sentences, and Gideon had moved over to take her place beside him, Maeve crawled along the base of the wall toward a long crack running through the old concrete, a place where someone had once started cutting through for a pipe and then abandoned the work. She pressed herself flat against the floor, put one eye to the opening, and stopped moving. She stayed that way for a very long time, long enough that Ezra, sitting with his back against the base of the column behind her, began to think she was hiding rather than looking. She wasn't hiding. She was counting. She counted the intervals between the windows breaking earlier, counted the beats between each sharp report and the echo returning from the wall of the warehouse across the way, counted the places where the rain fell straight down and the places where it slanted because wind was being funneled through the gap between the 2 rows of buildings. When she came back, the hair across her forehead was damp with dust and rainwater. She sat down, turned toward Ezra and Gideon, and told them what she'd seen in the flat voice of someone reading back a list. One man was on the water tower to the northeast, several stories higher than the mill roof, positioned on the side sheltered from the wind so rain wouldn't strike his scope. One man was on the roof of the warehouse row across the yard, near the gable, using a broken ventilation pipe as a rest. She hadn't found the exact position of the third man yet, but the shot that hit Wes had come upward from the south at a slight angle, which meant he was lower than the other two, closer, and he was the one covering the door. Gideon asked how she could know that much from looking through a crack in the wall. She didn't answer. She continued, saying there was one more person. Ezra asked who. She said the person giving the orders. She said the 3 shooters had remained silent ever since Wes went down, and that was the frightening part. Someone firing in panic would shoot again. Someone firing for money would finish the job quickly and leave. But the 3 men outside had done neither. They had fired exactly once and stopped, and they had held their positions in the rain all this time without anyone moving, anyone changing position, anyone firing even once more just to frighten them. No one was disciplined enough to do that if each man was making his own decisions. Someone was talking into their ears, and that person was telling them to wait. No one answered in the darkness. Then Ezra asked a completely different question, directing it into the room. He asked who had placed the food order that evening. Gideon took out his phone, opened the call history, turned the screen so the light wouldn't spill onto the wall, and searched. He said the order had been called in from the main office number, the desk phone downstairs that a dozen people shared, sometime that afternoon. No name was recorded. No one ever needed to give a name because it was a trivial matter, the kind of thing anyone passing that desk could do in 2 minutes. Maeve was bending down to retie her shoelace. Her hands stopped halfway through. She remained still for 1 beat, then looked up and asked how many meals had been ordered. Gideon said 12. She looked into the darkness ahead, and everyone could see the exact moment when something settled into place on her face. She said there were 12 people inside this building, including her. She said it without looking at anyone. Then she spoke aloud the thing no one else in the room had yet thought of, that whoever was outside hadn't been guessing how many people were inside. They didn't need to stand in the rain counting shadows through the windows. They only needed to know how many dinners had been ordered. Ezra sat up straighter. Gideon lowered the phone, and Maeve continued, her voice different now, lower and slower, saying there was something else. Someone had carried every one of those bags through the side door that night, walked through the entire room, placed every container on the tables, seen every face, counted all the way to the final meal, and was about to step outside at the exact moment the lights went out. She said, "I counted for them." No one said anything. Gideon opened his mouth as though he might say something kind, then stopped, because he knew that kind of sentence wouldn't help. Ezra looked at her for a long time in the darkness, then said, "You didn't know." She said, "That's right, I didn't know," she said, "but that doesn't change anything, and now I do." She turned toward the place where Wes was lying, where a newly married man's forehead carried a time written in ballpoint ink. Then she looked back toward the crack in the wall. Outside, the rain kept falling, and 3 men remained motionless in it, waiting for the 4th man to tell them what to do. On the wall beside the stairwell hung a fire escape plan yellowed with age inside a frame with cracked glass, something no one in the building had paid attention to all evening. Maeve took it down, laid it flat on the floor, and studied it by the weak glow of a phone screen with no signal. She traced 1 finger along the lines and stopped at a narrow strip running across the very bottom of the drawing, a thin passage connecting the old boiler room to the edge of the rear yard, the coal conveyor. Years ago, coal had been fed in from the yard through an underground chute running beneath the factory floor, and when the mill closed, the chute had only been sealed at both ends with cast iron covers. No one had filled it in. She said that passage came out at the rear yard, and the rear yard was completely hidden from both the water tower and the warehouse roof. She said one person, alone, moving very slowly, could get out that way. Ezra said no. He said it immediately, before she could finish explaining, and something in the way he said it made Gideon turn his head. Maeve asked why. She said plainly that, if he was about to tell her it was because she was a woman, he should find another reason, because she'd heard that one from men far better at explaining themselves than he was. Ezra said that wasn't why. He sat in silence for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer as even as it had been in the restaurant. He said, several years earlier, someone who had nothing to do with his family had died because of something involving them. He said that person had no connection to his family, owed no one $1, had simply been standing in the wrong place inside a story that had never belonged to them. He said he hadn't known the person's name until he read it in the newspaper, and he said he still remembered that name. He said tonight he wasn't adding another name to that list. Maeve listened to all of it. Then she asked who he intended to send. She asked it calmly, without anger, and that calmness made the question heavier. She said his men could get down into that chute, but once they were out, what exactly were they supposed to do? Because they had handguns and the 3 men outside did not. She said she wasn't asking anyone's permission. She was simply telling him the only option they had left. Then she turned toward the concrete column and added that the clock written across that man's forehead wasn't stopping for this conversation. And from this moment, there was only a little more than an hour left. From beside the concrete column, Wes called Ezra's name. Only his name. Nothing else. Ezra turned. Wes looked at him through the narrow spill of light, his eyes still open, his face drained white, and he didn't say another word. He only looked. Ezra held the young engineer's gaze for several breaths, then turned back to Maeve and said, "All right." He told her to take the chute, move slowly, and if anything at all felt wrong, she was to come back without asking anyone. She nodded. Gideon rose from where he'd been sitting, walked around the folding table, and pressed a small metal object into her palm, worn smooth on both sides. A round metal engraved with St. Christopher, its rim so worn that the lettering could no longer be read. He said, "It was my father's." He said, "Don't do anything foolish with it. Just bring it back." Then he turned away immediately, without waiting for her to thank him, because he didn't want to hear those words. Maeve closed her hand around the metal for 1 second, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. She said she needed to get something from her car. Her old car was parked close against the outside wall in a blind spot, only a few steps from the side door, and Gideon was the one who opened the door just enough for her to slip through. She opened the trunk in the darkness without turning on a light and pulled the raincoat away from the case beneath it. She dragged the case inside, set it on the concrete floor, knelt down, and released both latches. The lid opened. She took out what was inside, checked it once with her hands rather than her eyes, then closed the case and pushed it aside. The cast iron cover at the mouth of the chute was hidden behind the row of old boilers, and it took 3 people to lift it clear of the rim. Beneath it was a darkness so thick it seemed solid, and a current of cold air rose carrying the smell of damp coal that no one had disturbed in decades. Maeve sat on the edge and lowered her legs in first, and at that moment she already knew what she would have to leave behind. The chute was far narrower than she'd imagined, narrow enough that carrying the gun alone was already a problem. So she opened the ammunition box, slipped into the inside pocket of her coat exactly as many rounds as the fabric could hold without bulging, then set the rest on the concrete floor beside the opening, beneath the old boilers. Gideon looked at the box as though he meant to say something, then stopped. She lowered herself into the chute. The space between the floor and the ceiling was less than the length of an arm, not enough room to kneel, not enough room to brace herself on her hands and crawl. She lay flat on her stomach, planted both elbows into the coal dust, fine as powder, kept the gun lengthwise along her side, and began moving with her elbows and the toes of her shoes. Each pull of her elbows moved her about a hand's width. The dust was the worst part. It didn't rise like ordinary dust. It lifted slowly, then hung suspended inside that sealed darkness and refused to settle. And if she breathed through her mouth, it took only a few breaths before she started coughing. A cough in here would race through the steel tunnel and echo all the way to both ends. So she breathed through her nose, short and even, counting each breath so they wouldn't begin to quicken, because she knew perfectly well that what made a person breathe fast in a place like this wasn't the effort, but the thought that the ceiling was only a few inches above the back of her neck. She didn't think about that. She thought about the number written in ballpoint ink across a man's forehead. About halfway through, she reached a section where the ceiling had sagged, where the concrete above had cracked and collapsed downward, leaving a gap so low that her shoulders couldn't pass through. She flattened herself completely, her face turned to one side, one arm stretched straight ahead, the other pinned against her ribs, and moved forward inch by tightening her stomach and pushing with the toes of her shoes. The broken concrete above scraped down her back, then across her shoulder blade, then over her elbow, and she kept moving through it, knowing she was leaving skin behind without stopping to check, because checking wouldn't change anything. Once she was through, she lay still for a few breaths, until the shaking in her hands eased, then started moving again. Near the end of the chute, she heard footsteps. Not ahead of her, not behind her, directly above. the sound of shoes on concrete. Only one layer of floor separating them, moving from left to right, slow and even, the rhythm of someone searching rather than simply passing through. Maeve stopped. She didn't only stop moving, she stopped breathing entirely, not holding her breath, but cutting the rhythm off completely, and she lay there with her face pressed into the coal, while the footsteps reached the exact place above her and stopped. They stopped there. They didn't continue. She heard the soles turn against the floor, heard fabric brush against fabric, and something very faint that might have been someone speaking into a radio, or might only have been water dripping somewhere. Her chest began to burn. She counted. Then the footsteps moved again, gradually fading toward the far end of the building, and she remained still for a long while before allowing herself to breathe again. At the end of the chute was a cast-iron grate, mounted vertically into the wall, opening onto the edge of the rear yard. She planted both hands against it and pushed. It didn't move. She shifted position, braced her shoulder against it, drove with her legs, and pushed again. Still nothing. The hinges had rusted into a single mass, decades of rain and weather welding them to the frame, and she understood that if she kept pushing straight ahead, then when the grate finally gave way, it would break loose with a sound loud enough to be heard from the roof of the warehouse across the yard. So she stopped. She lay still, ran her fingertips along the edge of the grate, searching for the loosest point in the frame, then pressed her shoulder into one corner and pushed diagonally, not upward but sideways, putting all her force into that single point. The grate shifted by an inch. She pushed again. It moved farther, and it opened with a long, quiet creak, exactly the sound an old door makes when someone opens it in the middle of the night, not the sound of something being broken apart. The moment she reached the rear yard, the rain hit her, and for one brief second the cold water felt so good that she nearly stopped. She didn't. She stayed close to the wall, moving in a crouch, until she reached the base of the old water tower standing at the corner of the yard, the tower that decades earlier had supplied water to the boilers, and now remained only as a rusted mass of steel exposed to the sky. The ladder began about half a body length above the ground, and from there it ran straight upward, with no safety cage and no landing. She slung the rifle strap diagonally across her back, tightened it until the weapon lay close against her body, then started climbing. The first few rungs were easy enough. The steel was wet, but the rough edges still gave her something to grip, and the rain struck her face with the wind rather than coming sideways. The higher she climbed, the more the wind changed, and by the time she reached the middle, it had begun cutting sideways through the open space between the tower and the mill roof, pressing against her back in steady waves, not hard, but constant, the kind of wind that makes a person grip tighter, without realizing they are gripping tighter. By then, her hands held nothing except the ladder. The rifle rested behind her, useless, and she understood perfectly well that if anyone saw her now, everything would end here, with nothing more needing to be said. A little before halfway up, one of the rungs broke. It hadn't already been broken. It snapped beneath her foot, a dry crack swallowed by the rain, and her left foot dropped into empty space. Her entire body slipped with it. Her right hand lost the rung, her shoulder jerked backward, and in that exact instant only the fingers of her left hand remained hooked around the ladder. She hung there, not for long, only long enough to hear exactly where her heart was pounding, long enough to realize that the sound was louder than the rain, and long enough for one perfectly clear thought to cross her mind, that if she fell from here, no one would ever know what had happened to the 12th person. Then her right hand found the rung above. She pulled herself up, found a place for her foot on the next rung, and remained there for about 10 breaths with her forehead pressed against the cold steel until her hands began obeying her again. Then she kept climbing. On the tower platform, the wind was stronger, but a low railing blocked some of it, and for the first time that entire evening she could see the whole harbor district at once. The coreless textile mill lay below her like a long, low block of darkness, not a single illuminated window, the metal roof shining black beneath the rain. There was only one point of light, a tiny pool of dull yellow spilling through a broken window in the middle section, exactly where the emergency light was mounted on the concrete column, exactly where Wes had been lying. Maeve stared at that small point of light for a long time, and as she watched it, she understood something that made her entire body turn cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. Whoever was outside had cut power to the entire building, completely, cleanly, without leaving a single circuit untouched. Yet that battery-powered emergency light was still there. He could easily have dealt with it at the same time as everything else. He had left it on. He had left exactly one light burning, shining down on exactly one open space between the 2 rows of machines, then shot a man down in that very place and ordered his people to stop firing. He hadn't needed a target. He had needed a stage. She looked down again, and this time she looked in another direction. On the southern side of the mill was an emergency exit leading toward the waste yard, the same route the group had discussed in the darkness earlier as the most likely option if they were forced to run. From up here, she could see clearly that the exit opened onto a completely exposed yard, with nothing to provide cover, and that entire space sat cleanly within sight of both the warehouse roof and the lower position to the south that she still hadn't located. He wasn't stopping them from taking that way out. He had prepared it for them from the beginning. From the platform of the water tower, Maeve swept her eyes along the western edge of the parking lot, and she found it on the 3rd pass. Near the top of an old light pole that had gone dark, there was a square black box strapped in place with steel bands, and from that box protruded 2 short antennas angled toward the sky. It wasn't an electrical box. Electrical boxes didn't have antennas. She lowered herself onto the steel platform, pressed the stock of the rifle against her shoulder, and took a long time to steady her breathing after the climb, longer than she wanted. Then she fired. The black box jumped and hung loose from a single wire, and immediately, inside the pockets of 12 people in 2 different places, phones began vibrating at the same time. 40 seconds. Only 40 seconds. And none of the 3 of them knew it would be 40 seconds, because whoever was outside had more than one device like that, and only needed to switch frequencies. Gideon dialed first. He told the dispatcher there had been gunfire. He said the Harbor Industrial District. He said the old textile mill. The person on the other end asked for the street number, and he said there wasn't one. This place had been abandoned for decades. Just come in from the Harbor Road and turn where you see the water tower. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line. He hadn't even managed to explain how many entrances the building had when the connection gave a dry click and died. Ezra didn't call emergency services. He called 3 numbers. He called the first and said they would be coming out through the western drainage passage. Said it quickly, and told the person not to tell anyone. He called the second and said they would be going up onto the roof, giving the same instruction. Then he called the 3rd number, and with that person he spoke a little longer. He said they would come out through the southern door. His voice had gone hoarse, and he said, "Can you come get me? I don't trust anyone else right now." The person on the other end answered something the people around him couldn't make out. Ezra ended the call, leaned back against the column, and said nothing else to anyone. Maeve, standing in the rain on the steel platform of the water tower, called her younger sister. She didn't think about the police. The thought didn't enter her mind for even a second. The phone rang twice before Bridget answered, her voice heavy with sleep, asking why Maeve was calling so late. Maeve said she was on her way home, that she'd just finished her last delivery. She said it in the most ordinary voice she had, the same voice she always used when she said, "I'll take care of it," and she heard herself saying the words without realizing how tightly her other hand was gripping the railing. She asked how their mother had been that day, whether she'd managed to eat. Bridget said their mother had been awake, more awake than she'd been all week, that she'd eaten half a bowl of porridge and managed to sit up for a while, and that she'd mentioned Maeve's name. The girl added that their mother had asked what day it was, and when Bridget told her, she'd said, "Is that so? Then Maeve is probably out driving." Maeve stood still in the rain. Water ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away. Then she said, "Bridget?" And the girl answered, "Yeah?" Maeve said, "Tell Mom something for me." Bridget asked what. Maeve opened her mouth, and for one moment, she wasn't sure she could get the words out, because that sentence had been sitting in her throat for 7 years, and for 7 years, she had learned how to swallow it every time it rose. She said, "Tell Mom I'm sorry I put Dad's gun away." She said, "I took it out again." Bridget went silent on the other end. Then she said, "Maeve," she said, "where are you?" And her voice had changed completely, the voice of a younger sister who had just realized that her older sister had been lying from the very first sentence. She said, "Tell me where you are." Maeve listened to her sister calling for her, and she was about to say one more thing when the line died. It didn't fade. It cut off instantly, right in the middle, the way a light goes dark when someone pulls the plug. A few miles away, in the brightly lit hallway of the nursing home, a 19-year-old girl held the phone against her ear and heard exactly one thing before every sound disappeared: a dry, sudden static. Very far away, distorted by the connection, but clear enough to remain in her mind for the rest of that night. She called back. No signal. She called again, and then she sat down in a plastic chair outside the hallway and remained there. She slipped the phone into her pocket and didn't look at it again. Then she lowered herself onto the steel platform, pressed the stock of the rifle against her shoulder, and turned the scope toward the roof of the warehouse row across the yard. From where she was, that roof sat slightly below her, and near the gable was the broken ventilation pipe she had mentioned earlier. It took her a while to find him. Then she did. She didn't see a person. She saw a patch of darkness whose shape didn't belong to anything on that metal roof, lying close beside the base of the broken vent, and that dark shape rose slightly and fell again in a very slow rhythm. A person could remain perfectly still, but a person couldn't stop breathing. Maeve measured the wind by watching the rain. From that height, the rain wasn't falling straight down. It leaned at an angle, and the angle was diagonal rather than sideways, which meant the wind was coming in from the harbor and being bent by the mass of the mill. She calculated. She shifted her point of aim to one side and higher. She breathed in for 4 counts, breathed out for 3, and on the 4th count of the exhale, she pulled the trigger. She missed. The bullet went high and wide, striking the metal roof a little more than an arm's length from the dark shape, and where it hit, a tiny spark flashed and vanished instantly, so quickly that anyone not looking directly at it would have missed it. Maeve was looking directly at it, and that spark, lasting no more than a fraction of a blink, told her exactly how far she'd missed, and in which direction. 7 years. That rifle had lain inside a fabric-covered case for 7 years, through 3 moves, through hot summers and damp winters, and no one would have imagined that simply lying still for that long could be enough for some tiny part inside it to shift. She had picked it up believing it was still the rifle it had been 7 years ago. It wasn't. The dark shape on the warehouse roof disappeared. He didn't run. He simply slid a few inches lower, until he was hidden behind the raised seam of the metal roofing, and the way he disappeared made Maeve clench her jaw, because it told her the man hadn't panicked. He had simply received new information, and was processing it. Before that shot, he had believed everything he needed to worry about was contained inside the 4 walls of the mill. Now he knew it wasn't. She adjusted. She didn't touch the numbered dial. She had neither the time nor the light for that. She simply moved her point of aim by exactly the distance the spark had shown her, held that correction in her mind, and waited. She waited for him to move. He had to move, because from behind that metal seam he couldn't see anything, and a man like him couldn't tolerate being blind while someone unknown was somewhere out there. Less than a minute later, the barrel of his rifle appeared above the edge, then his hand, then the dark mass of his shoulder and head. Maeve didn't aim at that dark mass. She aimed lower, at the place where his hand rested against the rifle, at the mechanism above the trigger. She breathed out and fired. This time she hit. There was a sharp, clean sound of metal breaking, and the rifle in his hands kicked backward, then slid across the wet metal roof as the man jerked both hands away and folded over them. Then he did exactly what Maeve had known he would do. He didn't remain still and accept what had happened. He rolled to one side and reached toward his hip, where men in his line of work always carried a second weapon. In that exact moment, Maeve's scope was resting on the dark shape of his back, less than a hand's width from where his heart would be. She could have ended it right there. No one inside the mill would have known. No one outside would have known. There would have been nothing except one more gunshot in a night that had already held too many. She didn't do it. She lowered her aim slightly, moved it slightly to the right, and fired into his right shoulder, the shoulder connected to the hand, reaching toward his hip. The man on the warehouse roof collapsed, and the second gun fell from his hand, slid down the slope of the wet metal, and disappeared over the edge. He lay there, still breathing, unable to reach anything anymore. Maeve lifted her eye from the scope. She remained flat on the wet steel platform, the rain still falling against the back of her neck, and there was no thought in her mind except an old sentence she'd been hearing since before she was tall enough to rest her chin on the edge of a table. Inside the mill, the gunshots outside echoed through the broken window frames, and no one knew what they meant. But not long afterward, something else happened. The thing Ezra Marchetti had been sitting there waiting for, ever since he ended those calls. At the southern end of the building, where the corridor led toward the emergency exit, there was movement. Not one person, but 2. They moved along the outside wall without coming in, staying close to it, and they stopped exactly where the emergency door opened onto the exposed yard. Gideon heard them first, then the two engineers lying nearby, and in the darkness someone whispered that they were covering the southern exit. No one was covering the western drainage passage. No one had gone up to the roof. Both men had moved to exactly one place, exactly the route Ezra had mentioned privately to one person, and only one person. The entire mill went silent. It wasn't the same silence that had filled the last several hours, because before this, they had been silent out of fear of what was outside, and now they were silent because they had just understood what was inside. Gideon turned his head toward Ezra. Ezra sat with his back against the base of the column, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness in front of him, and he remained that way for several breaths. Then he spoke. He said, "For 30 years, he read the eulogies for my family." He said, "Now I know where he practiced." He said it in the same even voice he used when ordering food at Salvarosa, not raising it by half a note, with nothing in it that could be called anger, and that was precisely why the men lying around him felt a chill crawl up their spines. Gideon said the man's name aloud, asking it once more as if some part of him still hoped he had heard wrong. "Warren Ashby." Ezra didn't answer. He braced one hand against the floor and stood. Gideon asked what he was doing. Ezra didn't answer that either. He lifted a hand and adjusted the collar of his shirt, the small, meaningless gesture he always made before walking into a meeting, then stepped out from the shadow of the concrete column, walked straight into the open space between the two rows of weaving machines, and stopped in the center of the dull yellow pool cast by the emergency light. He had nothing on him. No gun, no knife, both hands hanging loose at his sides and open. Gideon hissed his name. Ezra didn't turn around. He stood there inside the pool of light the people outside had deliberately left behind, and he spoke out into the rain, not shouting, only raising his voice enough for it to carry through the broken windows. He said, "I'm Ezra Marchetti." He said, "I'm the name on your contract, and I'm standing right here." He said, "I'm asking you honestly, how much is that contract worth?" He said, "I'm asking because I can pay 3 times that amount tonight, transferred immediately, and I don't need to know who you are or where you came from." He said, "The only difference between those two numbers is that 11 people inside this building get to go home." Then he fell silent. He stood motionless in the light and waited. Rain tapped against the metal roof. No one outside answered. Not a single sound, not a single shadow, moving near the southern exit. Nothing except the dense silence of men who had been told they were not allowed to speak. Ezra gave one very slight nod, as if he had just received exactly the answer he had been expecting. Then he continued in the same voice. He said, "Then you're not doing this for money." He said, "Men who work for money always negotiate, even when they've already decided they won't." He said, "You're silent because you're afraid, and men only become that afraid when the person who hired them is even more afraid than they are." He said, "So now I know something I didn't know before. I know the man paying you is sitting somewhere out there right now, shaking." He hadn't finished the sentence when a shot cracked through the rain. It came from the south, low and much closer than the shot that had brought Wes down earlier that evening. And Ezra jerked backward half a step. He didn't fall. He remained standing for another beat, one hand rising to touch the left shoulder of his jacket, then looked down at his fingertips before lifting his eyes toward the rain one last time. Gideon burst from the darkness, grabbed Ezra by the collar, and yanked hard, dragging him backward behind the row of weaving machines, just as a second bullet struck the concrete where Ezra had been standing, throwing up a burst of white dust. Gideon hauled him behind the column, forced him down, tore open the shoulder of his jacket to look, and cursed in Italian with a word his mother had probably taught him when he was a boy. Ezra lay there breathing, his face pale, and said, "It only grazed me." Gideon said, "I know." Ezra said, "Then don't look at me like that." Gideon said, "I'm looking at you like this because you just did the stupidest thing I've seen in 30 years, and because I just figured out why you did it." Maeve came down from the water tower much faster than she'd climbed it, and she didn't go back through the coal chute. She circled the edge of the rear yard, stayed close to the row of empty containers, and climbed onto the old loading dock that connected directly to the side of the mill, where trucks had once backed in to take on cargo. The drop from the edge of the dock to the factory floor was higher than she'd expected. She lowered herself and let go, and when both feet hit the floor, her right knee twisted sideways with a burst of pain that shot all the way up into her hip. She dropped into a crouch, grabbed it, breathed out slowly through clenched teeth, then stood and kept moving. She didn't check it. Checking wouldn't change anything. By the time she reached the concrete column, Gideon was tying Ezra's torn shoulder back together, and Ezra was sitting against the column with the face of a man who had lost blood but hadn't yet given himself permission to know it. She looked once at his shoulder, looked at the number written in ballpoint ink across Wes's forehead, then said what she'd been calculating the entire way back. She said there were 2 men left outside, and both were moving toward the southern exit. She said from down here, no one could watch both directions at once, and the only place in the entire building that could cover the southern exit while still overlooking the rear yard was the 4th floor, the level with the row of broken windows facing the harbor. She said she was going up there. Then she stopped and added one more thing, her voice lower now, saying she had only a few rounds left in her pocket, and the rest were under the boilers beside the mouth of the coal chute, because she hadn't been able to carry them through. Ezra braced a hand against the floor and stood. Gideon told him to sit down. He didn't. He walked toward the boiler room, and Maeve had already reached halfway up the iron stairs when she heard something slide, followed by a heavy impact from below. He reached her a few minutes later with the ammunition box in his hand, and the right leg of his charcoal gray suit trousers was torn open in a long line from the thigh downward. The edge of the fabric darkened. He set the box on the broken concrete beside where she was lying and said nothing about his leg. She looked at it. He said, "The iron step was slippery." She said, "I didn't ask." He said, "I know." Then he sat against the wall behind her, stretched that leg out straight, and said, "I don't know how to shoot." He said, "I never learned, and I don't intend to. But I know how to count ammunition, and I'm not going to sit downstairs listening to your shots and guessing what's happening anymore." Maeve lowered herself onto her stomach, settled the rifle stock against her shoulder, and aimed through the broken window. She said, "Then count." And he counted. Every time she fired, he said the number remaining aloud, evenly, never fast, never slow. And after a few shots, she realized he wasn't doing it so she would know. He was doing it so she wouldn't have to count inside her own head, so she wouldn't have to give up even one corner of her mind to that task. At one point, the rain eased, and both of them fell silent. He looked at her for a while and said, "You have blood on your face." She said, "It's not mine." He said, "I know." Then reached up, pulled back the sleeve of his suit jacket, and wiped the streak from her cheek, quick and clean, without asking first, the way someone might brush a speck of dust from another person's shoulder. That suit was worth several months of her rent. He did it as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Then he asked where she'd gotten the rifle, and where she'd learned to do this. She didn't take her eye off the scope. She said it had been in her car, and that her father taught her before he died. She said there had never been a guitar inside that case. She said she hadn't opened it in 7 years, and that morning she'd made an appointment to sell it at a pawn shop on Broad Street. But she'd arrived 15 minutes late, and the shop had already closed. After saying that, she fell silent again, her eye still fixed through the scope. Ezra didn't tell her she was lucky. He didn't say everything happened for a reason. He sat quietly for a long time, then said, "My father left me a name." He said, "That name can open every door in this city, and it's also the reason 3 men are lying outside in the rain tonight waiting for me to lift my head." He said, "Your father left you something far more useful." Maeve didn't turn around, but her finger lifted from the trigger for one beat before settling back into place. The radio was in the side pocket of the man on the warehouse roof, and when he collapsed, it slid down the wet metal toward the gutter just across the narrow alley beneath the 4th floor window. A broken, intermittent hiss mixed with the sound of the rain, and it took her a moment to figure out where it was coming from. Then a voice came through, distorted, distant, but clear. There were 2 voices. The first belonged to the man at the southern exit, asking a short question, then asking it again because no one answered. The second voice replied, and Ezra sat up straight. He knew that voice. He had been hearing it since before he was tall enough to see over the dining table. The man asked why both men on the high positions had gone silent, and Ashby told him to hold his position. The man said someone was firing in from outside, not from inside the mill. And there was something in his voice that sounded very much like fear. Ashby told him to calm down. He said this wasn't new. He said it the way someone might speak to a nephew who was worrying too much. And then he continued, and it was what came next that made both people on the 4th floor stop breathing. He said something exactly like this had happened several years ago. He said there had been someone else outside. Someone who had started looking into things that were none of his business. Someone who had followed numbers through the Marchetti books and believed he was following the Marchetti family. He said the man's name was Callahan. He said Callahan was a harbor patrol officer, that he was good, patient, and had gone farther than anyone before him, far enough that he had begun looking past the Marchettis and toward where the money was actually flowing. He said they had cleaned the whole thing up within a week. He said the difficult part wasn't what happened outside the warehouse. The difficult part was the paperwork afterward. He said he had spent 3 nights putting together a proper file, proper enough that even Callahan's own colleagues believed it, proper enough that they removed his name from the honor board at the station, cut away everything they could from his wife and children, and closed the entire case in less than a month. He said the best part wasn't getting rid of one man. The best part was that afterward, whenever anyone heard the name Callahan, they thought of the name Marchetti, and not one person, through all those years, ever thought to look one step beyond that name. He said tonight was no different. Hold your position. Then the radio hissed once and went silent. On the 4th floor, no one spoke. Maeve remained exactly where she was, her cheek against the rifle stock, her eye still through the scope, and for a long time she didn't move a single muscle. Then she reached down, pressed the release, and removed the magazine from the rifle. She held it in her palm. She looked at it. She turned it over, pressed the top round down with her thumb and let it rise again, pressed it down and released it. The motion anyone trained to shoot performs thousands of times without ever needing to think about it. She did it 3 times. Then she slid the magazine back into place, heard it lock, and returned her hand to its position on the rifle. Ezra said nothing through all of it. He sat against the wall behind her with his injured leg stretched out straight, and he didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't say any of the things people usually say. He looked at her back, at the delivery jacket with one sleeve torn away at the shoulder, at the 2 hands holding the rifle, and he simply remained silent. Rain tapped against the metal roof. Below them, 4 floors down, a man who had been married less than a year lay with a time written across his forehead in ballpoint ink. Finally, Ezra spoke. He didn't say he was sorry, he said. I heard that name once. He said, I was 27 then. I was in Boston, and I read it in the newspaper. He said, I read those few lines, folded the paper, and believed them, every word. And for 7 years, I've believed them. He said, I thought it was something my father had done. Then he was silent for a very long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer even. He said, Earlier, I told you about someone who had nothing to do with my family but died because of something involving us. He said, I didn't know that person's name until I read it in the paper. He said, I still remember that name. Maeve didn't turn around. She said, I know you remember. She said it very softly, and she said nothing else. Her index finger remained laid along the side of the rifle, not on the trigger, and it didn't shake. The sound of footsteps on the iron staircase came first, and Ezra was the first to hear it. He touched Maeve once at the ankle, then pulled his hand away. She had already heard it. One person, not 2, was coming up from the 3rd floor landing, moving slowly, 1 step to each beat. The rhythm of someone who knew the thing he was looking for was very close. Ezra quietly said the number of rounds left in the rifle. 3. Maeve turned on the broken concrete floor, pulling the rifle with her, and aimed toward the mouth of the stairwell, the dark rectangular opening about 40 steps from where she lay. At that distance, everything she had ever learned became useless. There was no wind to calculate, no bullet drop to compensate for, no time between pulling the trigger and the round reaching its target. At that distance, only one thing remained, whether the hand holding the rifle was steady, and hers wasn't. Her right knee hurt so badly that the pain was climbing all the way into her shoulder. Her whole body was soaked and cold, and she hadn't eaten anything since morning. She breathed in for 4 counts. She breathed out for 3. She did exactly what her father had made her do thousands of times on the grass behind their house, the thing she had thought was ridiculous when she was 12. And she did it again on the 4th floor of an abandoned textile mill after midnight. The man stepped onto the final stair. He didn't rush out. He stopped at the edge of the stairwell opening, pushed the barrel of his gun out first, and swept it slowly across the 4th floor in a wide arc. By the time the barrel reached her position, she had already pulled the trigger. The gunshot inside the enclosed space struck her ears with painful force. The weapon in his hands burst apart across the upper assembly, kicked backward, and he dropped it, staggering half a step back. That half step brought him right to the edge of the stairs. Maeve didn't fire the second round into him. She fired at the joint between the top stair and the steel frame supporting it, the weld that had been rusting for decades, and the entire step collapsed beneath his feet. He fell onto the landing below with the broken steel crashing down around him, and from there were no stairs left for him to climb. One round remained. No one fired again. Not long afterward, light began sweeping across the ceiling of the 4th floor. Blue, then red, then blue again, sliding over the stained walls. The first patrol car had driven past 3 warehouse blocks along the harbor road, stopped to ask directions at a gas station that was still open, then finally turned toward the place with the water tower. Then came a second car, then a third. Loudspeakers, footsteps running across wet concrete. Someone shouted, asking whether anyone was inside. Gideon answered from the ground floor. Maeve lowered the rifle onto the concrete and sat with her back against the wall, and only then did she allow herself to feel her knee. Ezra pushed himself to his feet. She asked where he was going. He said downstairs. He went down the western stairwell, past the place where they were lifting Wes onto a stretcher, past Gideon speaking with a police officer, and walked straight out into the yard, where blue and red lights reflected across the puddles. At the edge of the parking lot, beyond the police tape, a dark-colored car was parked close to the curb. It had been there for a while. The engine wasn't running, the lights were off, and the person inside didn't get out. Ezra walked over. He opened the passenger door and got in. Warren Ashby sat behind the wheel with both hands resting on his thighs. He turned and looked at Ezra's torn shoulder, looked at the blood-soaked leg of his trousers, and said, "Thank God." He said, "I've been sitting here since you called. I didn't dare go inside. I didn't know what to do." Ezra said, "I know you've been sitting here." Then he said, "Tell me." Ashby asked what he meant. Ezra said, "Tell me from the beginning, from the year you started." And he said it in exactly the same voice he used at Salvarosa, and he didn't move, and inside the breast pocket of his jacket, the line he had opened before walking out of the building was still connected, and on the other end, a woman named Corinne Falk sat in silence and listened without saying a single word for nearly 10 minutes afterward. As for the man who had been speaking over the radio throughout that night, he wasn't inside any of the cars. By the time the first light swept across the yard, he was already down by the water, and by the time the police had finished putting up the perimeter tape, the small boat carrying him had reached the middle of the river, running without lights, heading down toward the mouth of the bay. Wes Halloran was wheeled into surgery while it was still dark outside, and brought back out when gray morning light had begun to gather beyond the hallway windows. The doctor said they had saved his leg. He added that if the tourniquet had been applied any later, or if the person who applied it hadn't written down the time, this conversation would have been very different. He asked who had done it. Gideon turned his head toward the row of plastic chairs at the far end of the hallway, where a young woman in a delivery jacket with one sleeve torn away was sitting with a new brace wrapped around her knee, and he said nothing. Delia Halloran arrived in the middle of the morning. She had taken the earliest flight with an available seat, and she came into the hallway with a handbag still hanging from her shoulder. Her eyes red, her hair tied back in a hurry. She went into her husband's room first. She stayed in there for quite a while. When she came out, she walked straight toward the row of plastic chairs, and Maeve stood, because when someone walks toward you, you stand, and Delia embraced her. The embrace had no purpose at all. It wasn't meant as a thank you. It wasn't meant to say anything, and it wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was simply a woman who had spent hours on an airplane carrying a thought she hadn't dared to think all the way through, and now she no longer had to think it. She held Maeve and didn't let go, and Maeve, who hadn't cried once through that entire night, stood still and allowed the embrace to last exactly as long as it needed to last. Afterward, Delia stepped back, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and asked a very strange question. She asked whether, while they were inside there, he had left any message for her. She asked it in the voice of someone who had prepared herself to hear the final words she had almost been forced to hear. Maeve hadn't had time to answer when Wes called out from inside the room. He was still weak, his voice rough and hoarse, but he had heard everything. He said yes, he had left a message. He said that at the time, he had asked Maeve to turn on her phone and record something for Delia, just in case. Delia turned and looked at her husband. Wes said Maeve had refused. He said she'd told him to say it himself, because she wasn't taking that order. Delia stood there for a moment, then she laughed, and the laugh broke into a sob halfway through, and she had to sit down. By the afternoon, Lieutenant Corinne Falk arrived. She took statements for several hours in a small room the hospital had lent them, asking carefully about every detail, taking notes, asking again, and Maeve answered everything. Near the end, Falk put down her pen and sat quietly for a moment. Then she said the preliminary scene report was already in. She said Maeve had fired 9 shots the night before. She said not one of them had been aimed at a fatal point. Not a single one. She said she'd been doing this work for 22 years, and she'd never encountered a case like it. Not even among the best-trained people she knew. She didn't ask why. She simply said it, and let the words remain there between them. Maeve looked down at her hands resting on the table. She said, "Can I ask you for something?" Falk said, "Go ahead." Maeve said, "Don't let my name get into the papers." Falk raised an eyebrow and said this story was going to make the front page, that there would be reporters, that people would start digging, and that if Maeve wanted it, this was the kind of thing that could change a person's entire life for the better. Maeve said, "I know." She said, "My sister is in her 2nd year of school." She said, "She has to work evenings in the cafeteria. And if everyone at school suddenly knows who her sister is and what she did inside an abandoned mill after midnight, she won't make it through that year." She said, "That's all I'm asking." Falk looked at her for a long time. Then she closed her notebook and said, "I can't promise, but I'll do everything I can." She stood, walked to the door, then turned back and added one more thing. She said, "Miss Callahan, your father worked for Harbor Patrol, didn't he?" Maeve said yes. Falk gave one small nod, said nothing else, and walked out. A few days later, Maeve went to Ezra's office in the building on Westminster Street, the same building she had walked in and out of more times than she could count with cups of coffee in her hands. She took the elevator instead of using the delivery entrance, and the person at the reception desk called her by name without having to ask. Ezra was sitting behind his desk with one arm in a sling and one leg stretched out to the side. He pointed to the chair across from him. She sat down, and she didn't waste time. She said, "I need to tell you something before you start thinking about me in a way that isn't true." She said, "I didn't take that delivery that night by accident." She said, "For the past 2 years, I've only taken the harbor route and the route to this building. I turned down other routes, even when they paid more. I know the faces of almost everyone who comes in and out of this floor. I know what you usually drink and when you drink it." She said, "That night, I saw the address in the industrial district and I knew where it was, and I accepted the order because I knew you would be there." She said, "For 7 years, I believed the name Marchetti was what killed my father. And I didn't have money for a lawyer. I didn't have anyone behind me, and I didn't have any other way except to stand at the door and watch." She said, "That was all I could do, and I've been doing it for 2 years. When she finished, she sat still and waited. Ezra didn't look surprised. He didn't say a word. He pulled open the bottom drawer on his right, took out a thin file inside a faded hardcover, and placed it on the desk, turning it so she could read the name written in the corner, Callahan. She looked at it and didn't reach for it. He said, "When my father died, I opened his safe." He said, "There were many things inside, and I understood most of them immediately, even though I didn't want to understand them. There was one thing I couldn't understand." He said, "My father kept this file more carefully than things that should have been kept more carefully. And there was almost nothing inside it except a few newspaper clippings, one report, and several pages in his own handwriting." He said, "I read it over and over for almost a year and couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't understand why a man who had done the things my father had done would preserve the file of a disgraced Harbor Patrol officer when he had no reason to keep it." He said, 11 months ago, I started looking for that man's family," he said. "I searched in my own way, which means I asked around without asking anyone directly, because I didn't want anyone to know what I was looking for." He said, "I found the wife's name. I found the nursing home's name. I found the names of both daughters. Then I stopped, because I didn't know what I intended to say to them once I found them." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You brought me coffee every Tuesday morning." He said, "For all 11 of those months." Maeve looked at the file on the desk. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know." He said, "I know you didn't." That same week, Ezra went to his grandmother's house for dinner. Rosetta sat at the head of the table as she had since his grandfather was still alive, and she listened while he told her everything without interrupting him once, even when he said he had turned over all the records, even the pages no one would ever have known about if he had kept them, even the pages that carried his father's name. When he finished, she sat in silence. Then she pushed her plate aside, reached across the table, and took his uninjured hand in hers. She said she had married into this family when she was 19 years old, that she had lived her entire life inside that name, and that she knew exactly how heavy that name was. She said, "Your father preserved the name." She said, "You preserved what it means." She said, "Whichever one is harder is the one worth more." Then she let go of his hand, pulled her plate back into place, and told him to eat before the food got cold, because she wasn't the kind of woman who let a sentence like that remain on the dinner table any longer than necessary. The hearing took place on a late winter morning in a small courtroom at the federal courthouse, and the opposing attorney had chosen his strategy before he ever walked through the door. He didn't touch what had happened that night. He went after the person telling the story. He asked Maeve how far she had gone in school, asked what she did for a living, asked how much she earned each month, asked whether she owed hospital bills and how much, and he asked every one of those questions in the most polite voice one person could use while speaking to another in front of a jury. Then he said it was difficult to believe that a food delivery woman with no home and no stable profession had somehow been in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, and done exactly the things she claimed to have done, and that perhaps the jury ought to ask itself why someone carrying that much debt would tell a story so favorable to a family that wealthy. Maeve sat still. She didn't answer. In the row of seats behind her, Ezra Marchetti stood. He asked the presiding judge for permission to speak. He carried no papers, didn't open a briefcase, didn't look down. He simply stood there and began to recite. He recited the name of every shell company, every account, every person who had signed, and the date of every transfer of money, one after another, without stumbling, without stopping to remember. He recited transactions from years when he had still been in middle school. By the time he reached somewhere past the 10th transaction, the opposing attorney rose to object, and the judge told him to sit down. Ezra continued. When he stopped, the entire courtroom was silent, and he added only one sentence, that he had grown up in the house where those names were spoken at the dinner table, and he asked the attorney which part he would like to hear next. Then he sat down. The rest of the case needed no one to retell it. The file Warren Ashby had spent 3 straight nights constructing years earlier was entered into evidence, and everything false eventually revealed itself as false. Sergeant Daniel Callahan's name was removed from the list of those who had disgraced the profession he had lived and died serving. Harbor Patrol restored his record, restored the benefits attached to it, and the insurance that had been cut off years earlier was reinstated retroactively. The bill that had been pinned to the refrigerator door in the room above the laundromat disappeared, and it didn't disappear because some wealthy person walked in and paid it for them. It disappeared because at last that father had been able to pay it himself, 7 years after he was no longer there. On the day they returned his badge, Maeve brought it to the nursing home. Her mother was more lucid than usual that day, sitting propped against her pillows with one hand resting on the blanket. She held the piece of metal, turned it slowly in her palm, lifted it close to her eyes and looked at it for a long time, and her finger traced the engraved words as though she were reading something she had once known by heart. Then she looked up at her daughter and asked, "Has your father come home?" Maeve opened her mouth to answer. She couldn't. The woman who had spent an entire night lying on broken concrete without shedding a single tear, who had crawled through a coal chute in the darkness, who had hung by one hand from an iron ladder in the rain, collapsed at the edge of that bed, buried her face in the thin blanket beside her mother's hand, and cried like a child. Her mother placed her other hand on Maeve's hair and patted it gently, and she didn't ask anything else. 1 year later, the Corliss textile mill was gone. In its place stood rows of housing for harbor workers, with low rents, and every afternoon the sound of children playing rose from the new playground in the courtyard between the buildings. There was a scholarship fund for the children of police officers and veterans in the area, named after a harbor patrol sergeant, and not one piece of its paperwork carried the name Marchetti. Bridget graduated from nursing school in the spring, and in the front row sat her older sister wearing the only decent coat she owned. Wes Halloran could walk with a cane and took a job as a construction site superintendent, and he still told anyone willing to listen about the time he asked someone to record a final message, and was flatly refused. As for the man who had spent that entire night speaking through the radio, he was arrested the following autumn at a dock several hundred miles away after Warren Ashby gave up his name in exchange for a lighter sentence. One October afternoon, it rained again. That same persistent, gentle kind of rain the city knew so well. Ezra stood waiting outside the laundromat with a small box in his hand. There wasn't a ring inside. Inside was the old St. Christopher medal that had belonged to Gideon's father, worn smooth with age and polished clean again, and Gideon had sent word that he didn't want it back because she had kept it better than he ever had. Maeve lifted it from the box. Then Ezra asked her one question. A very simple question. Only a few words. Standing there in the rain outside a laundromat on the corner of Broad Street. And she answered, "This story leaves behind something very simple. What gives a person value isn't what they own. Not the suit, not the watch, not the name written across a building. It is what they choose to do when no one is watching. In the darkness, inside a tunnel, when the only reason to keep going is because they themselves have decided that going on is necessary. And the greatest form of kindness isn't saving someone. It is never giving yourself the right to decide who deserves to live and who doesn't. A person's honor can be taken away in a single month, but if even one person still believes, and one person is willing to speak, then 7 years later, that honor can still come home. If this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that every day we can have more stories of kindness to listen to together. How did tonight's story make you feel? What part of it stayed with you the most? And if you had been there, what would you have done inside that mill? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone listening to this story strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.